Dr. Janesick, wonderful to have you with me today in this important topic about qualitative research.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Wonderful. So, when a researcher should use qualitative methods?
Thank you, Dr. Zalikat, for that wonderful question, which will open our conversation. And let me say I'm very happy to be part of this series of conversations for a number of reasons. One, I've been doing this all my life and teaching this all my life and writing about it all my life. So, of course, I get giddy when someone says, why don't you come over and talk about this? So, now, in answer to that question, well, it depends. My answer is it depends. What does it depend on? First of all, what kind of question are you asking? What is your approach to qualitative methodology, which is varied and which has many, many subheadings and approaches? For example, let me just read you a couple of the things I've written in my latest book, which is the 3rd edition of Stretching Exercises for Qualitative Research. This book is used in many universities across the world, especially in Australia, Canada, the US, and other parts of Europe and Asia. But one of the things I stress in this book is developing habits suited to the qualitative researcher. And before you start developing these habits, which are the key approaches and techniques of qualitative methods, the technique of observing, the technique of interviewing, the technique of writing, the technique of analysis and interpretation, which is across all research, of course. But let me just say, I'll read you some terms that identify qualitative work. That's how specific you need to be when you're selecting your technique. Here are a few of them. Action research, historiography, narrative research, webography, interpretive interactionist research, oral history, autoethnography, ethnoarchaeology, teacher research, case study, descriptive study, ecological study, ethnography, field research, microethnography, portraiture, life history. Now the new ones, netnography, where people are doing the ethnography on the net, Skypeography, where you interview through Skype, and Skype has some wonderful free downloading software bits that can help you easily put the whole interview on your computer, and then, of course, you still have to transcribe it. So that just gives you sort of an overview of different approaches to qualitative work. For example, you would never say, if you're doing a statistical study, I'm doing a quantitative study. No, you're doing a specific kind of study using a specific statistical technique. Same thing with qualitative. When you say, I'm doing a qualitative study, we want to know more. We want to know what specific technique. And then it's not that simple to do. People think, oh, I'm going to do a qualitative study because it's easier, but it's not.
Please share with us some key characteristics of qualitative research.
Time in the field is one of the key checks and balances in the method. Time in the field has to equal the time in analysis. So when anybody says they're going to do a qualitative study, it depends on your question, what you want to know, but it also depends on the investment in time that you can put in. If you think you're graduating in December, add 6 months. If you think you're graduating in May, add another 6 months. For those of you writing the dissertation. If you've had me in class, you've heard this before. A dissertation doesn't write itself. You have to do this practicing of all these techniques. The other big thing about qualitative research that people may not be too happy about accepting is you have to be an above average writer, because it's a narrative technique that gets you through, and the narrative description are in effect the equivalent of numbers. In the other paradigm you use numbers. In this paradigm you use words. But you might be saying to yourself, what are some of the characteristics of qualitative work? So let me tell you some. First of all, it's holistic. It attempts to understand the whole picture of the social context under study. For example, the purpose of all qualitative work is to understand the lived experience of an individual, if you have an N of one, or a group of individuals. And you're studying these individuals over time. In the other paradigm, you're predicting, you're controlling things, you even control experiments. It's all about prediction and control for a purpose that's unlike our purpose. In quantitative methods, you want to actually pretend to generalize, because sometimes that doesn't even work in the quantitative arena. But in the qualitative arena, we say we're not interested in generalization. We're interested in one thing, understanding this lived experience and what we can learn from this individual case. I hope that makes sense, because it's critical for you to accept.
What are other main characteristics of qualitative study?
The other thing about a holistic approach to research, you have to realize some things. You have to accept the fact that we live in a chaotic, disorganized, non-linear world. If you think the world is rational, this is not the technique for you. There's no rationality in the public space. There's no rationality in personal interactions. And your job as a qualitative researcher is to find those holes in the story. Find where it's irrational. Find out how to make sense of someone's life because of the fact that we are in a chaotic kind of moment in history. And all things relate to this holistic approach. The social context itself. Where are you placed geographically? What is the history of the space that the person's working in? What is the person's personal history? For example, how many marriages, divorces, deaths have they experienced in their life? And you too, by the way, you're deconstructing your own role as the researcher. In the other paradigm, you don't deconstruct your role. You're supposed to be dispassionate and objective. Here, in qualitative research, we are subjective, we accept it, we embrace it, we are joyful about it, but we identify our subjectivities early on. We say, our role is this, this, and this. I believe these things. I value these things. So in the other paradigm, they're worried about bias. We are not worried about bias because we disclose up front what our values and beliefs are. And by the way, notice I didn't use the word bias. I'm saying we're disclosing values, beliefs, our own ideology, and our own theoretical frame that we interpret this data through. So we do not use the same language. So when you try to appropriate jargon and language from one paradigm into another, you get into trouble. So you have to do something that's very hard to do. I have to ask you this, to give up the language from another paradigm, put it in a box, put that box up on the ceiling, on a shelf somewhere, high up there so you don't have to look at it. And now you start learning a new vocabulary, a new language, and a new set of jargon to be able to be a member of this universal community of qualitative researchers. Because remember, when you're doing your dissertation in a qualitative way, you're also part of a bigger community. All the people on this campus who are doing qualitative work, all the people in the country and other universities similar to our university. And so when you go on to your job at a university someday, you'll be also a member of that community. So all this relates to that holistic big picture. Another characteristic is we look at relationships within a certain context. What are the power relationships? Who's in charge? What does the system look like? What's the subculture that your participants are members of? Another characteristic, we refer to the personal face-to-face interactions of people and what they mean to those people. Don't impose your beliefs on the participant. Let them talk, let them go, let them tell you in the interviews, which you can deconstruct later, and as you go, let them tell you what their life means to them. Another characteristic, we're attentive to detail. We get everything down because more is more in this technique. You get the description of the setting, the description of the context, the description of the person and the people in their life. Here's another one. It demands equal time in the field as equal time in analysis. You can't give up that analytical time. And as you live with the data and you reread your transcripts, your field notes, any documents you collected from the field, as you reread all this, then things start to make sense. And people say, well, how do I know I have enough data? How do I know when to leave the field? And all I can tell you is you'll know when you saturate. When you get the same answers over and over from your participants, you know that it's time to leave. Also, they'll tell you, I'm done now, This is all I can do. People are funny that way, but it's the wonderful thing about qualitative research. Here's a big one. It incorporates a complete description of your role as the researcher. I alluded to it earlier. Yes, you'll have to tell about your values, your beliefs, your biases. For example, if you say, I was a 6th grade teacher and I want to study 6th grade teachers, that's important to know because then the reader realizes, oh, you have a context. You share a belief system in things that have to be done in 6th grade. Or whatever. You were a principal, now you're studying principals. You were a counselor, you're studying counselors. So there's something important about disclosing that complete role. Then you have to say how many hours in the field, how many interviews, how many documents, and so on. So that later in the dissertation you get to list in your appendix, here's the list of documents I reviewed. Here's the initial codes and categories from the transcripts. Here's the final codes, and so on. You probably have seen some sample qualitative dissertations, and you can find them in dissertation abstracts, and they're available now free, the whole thing, downloadable. Another characteristic, it relies on you as the research instrument. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, you're going to have to develop some habits of writing, observing, interviewing, analyzing, and being creative. You have to be creative in this kind of work. For example, one of the approaches in qualitative methods very popular today is arts-based approaches where you can integrate photography, video, artwork. You might ask a participant to draw himself or herself. You might ask a participant to give you an example of art that inspires, or so on. So this gets conversations going, and in fact, many researchers call interviewing a guided conversation. Whatever you call it, it's still an interview, it's still on tape, and you still have to transcribe it. But because you have to rely on yourself as the research instrument, you have to listen. So you have to practice active listening, you have to be training these ears to hear, the eyes to see what is in front of you. For example, you might be walking into Starbucks every day in the library and not really notice what's going on or what people are wearing or so on. But if you were there as an observer, believe me, you would be surprised at how many hours it takes you to describe that setting, which is one of the key parts of your chapter 4, description of the setting, description of the people, and then you get into the data. Another qualitative marker is you're aware of ethical issues in the field and you observe all informed consent procedures, the correct protection of your participants through their anonymity. You change the names of participants, change the name of the setting. Of course, by your demographic description, people will say, oh, let's see, this is from a public university in a metropolitan area. It has to be Tampa or it has to be Hillsborough. That's okay. They can guess about that. But your job is to protect your members, and so you change their names. People say, well, what should I change their names? Here are some techniques and strategies that students of mine have used. One, they ask them, what would you like your name to be? Or you take the person's name, like Adam Smith, and you rearrange the letters to somehow get to another name. So you still preserve the integrity of their name, but without using the exact name. So, things like this. Or if you have a theme and a metaphor in your analysis. For example, in my book, Oral History for the Qualitative Researcher, because I used the choreography metaphor, I named all the participants and all the stories we told with names of choreographers, famous choreographers in history. I use that throughout. Others have used prototypes. For example, I had a student who studied in the Chicago public schools, Afrocentric public schools with Afrocentric female administrators, and he named them after famous women in history, like Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the principals. The other female was Hillary Clinton. The other one was Mary Bethune, and so on. So he went through history to look at who is a person in history that's a leader, who's like this leader, and then he named them. So you can use your creative energies and your creative habit that you're developing to generate some names. Finally, it tells a story. You're going to be telling a narrative story about the lived experience of someone or a group of people, and comparing and contrasting and making sense of it for your field in this long history of ideas that you're part of. So this narrative has to be in writing with a nice flow, cohesion, coherence, all those markers of good writing, and you may even insert poetry. For example, I have students who open each chapter with a poem that's constructed from the data. We call those found data poems. We look in the transcripts and we find a poem that addresses what we want to do throughout the dissertation in terms of themes, the energy of the person, all those things that will tell us more about the story that you construct. So, here's another thing I want to share with you while I'm still on this first question. Because Dr. Zalikat asked me to address this earlier. What are some of the questions related to qualitative research methods? So I've put down 11 of them. So let's go through some of these. First of all, questions of a quality of a given innovation or program or curriculum. What is the quality of something? What's the quality of X? Those are the kind of questions that are suited to qualitative work. Questions regarding meaning or interpretation. What does this mean? What is the interpretation of these actors about this curriculum, for example? 3, questions related to the socio-linguistic aspects of a setting. And that's why many times you'll see a lot of language arts dissertations that are done qualitatively, linguistic dissertations, and so on. Questions related to an entire system, a system such as a classroom, a school, a district, or a counseling center. Questions regarding the politics, economics, and the social aspects of schooling and the capacity for the same. For us in the area of curriculum and curriculum inquiry, this is a big one. Questions regarding the hidden curriculum. What's not stated in the school? What's not stated in the counseling event? What's not stated in a business or a corporation? Like if we were to, let's say we studied the provost office here at USF. What's not stated in the way it runs, and so on. Here's a big one. Questions pertaining to the social context of schooling, especially, and this is big, race, class, and gender issues. Because really, what are kids and teachers talking about today? Race, class, and gender issues. So it's beautiful for qualitative work. Questions that pertain to implicit theories and how the social world operates. Very important for qualitative researchers. A big one, questions about a person's life, their work, their views on their life and their work. Questions that are viewed as controversial, always and only can be found through interviewing and observing. It's very hard for a person who to answer a survey honestly if they're not dealing with you, the researcher, face to face. And finally, questions related to public policy that, of course, are related to race, class, and gender, because in the USA today, you know, and this is what's happening now, we're now in October and we're close to an election, everything's about race, poverty, religion, separation of church and state. All those controversial things are what qualitative researchers get giddy over. We're just delighted to go in and study this. So, all that from one question.
What do you think about the role of the researcher in qualitative studies?
Well, the role of the researcher is very important, and we'd like to disclose everything about the role of the researcher. For example, you would list what your values are, your beliefs about the study, and how this study was created because of your interest. And so what you're doing is really a catalog of your subjectivities. And we embrace subjectivity, we own it, we name it, and we move right on with the study. Good question. Okay. First of all, I'm asked this question regularly, and many of my students have dealt with it in their dissertations and in subsequent articles. And one of the things that we do in qualitative research, and that I urge everyone to use as a data set for your study, and that's to keep a researcher reflective journal. This is sort of like notes to yourself about the study. What's happening in the study? This is one way to look at, apparently a lot of people are worried about bias, and how do you take care of your biases? Well, you write about them, you reflect about them, you spell them out, and you deal with it. So that's one of the checks and balances in the system. I mentioned earlier, one of the checks and balances is staying over time in the field. That helps tremendously. You cannot do a quick and dirty qualitative dissertation. There's no such person, animal. You can't do it. You have to stay in the space. And once you start interviewing people, you're going to find that you don't want to leave the space. You want to know more, and that's how you do it, through person-to-person, face-to-face engagement. So you have this as a check and balance, the Researcher Reflective Journal. You have staying over time, and we also have a peer reviewer of your field notes, peer reviewer of your journal, peer reviewer of the initial categories connected to transcripts. So they'll be looking at your transcript and saying, you know, you missed something big, or you put too much emphasis on this item. What about this item? Look at this, how much it means to this person. So we have some built-in checks and balances that sort of take care of all those things that people in the other paradigm are worried about, or seem to be. Oddly enough, most people who really do stat well don't worry about those things. It's people who are beginners and newbies to this field and only took 1 or 2 classes in research, and then they're all tied up because they themselves haven't deconstructed this. So it's not a big worry at all for me or other qualitative researchers, because we have enough built into the system to keep the story upfront, flowing, and the role of the researcher clear. You have to spell out everything that happens. And because you're in the social world, everything changes, and you have to be able to accept that.
Now, what are the key characteristics of a qualitative researcher?
I often ask people, what are some of the characteristics for a person to be a good qualitative researcher? Well, so they come up with the normal list: patience, determination, focus, self-awareness. But also you have to be open to all kinds of change. You have to suspend your disbelief and be willing to take anything in. For example, I recently had a student who's dealing with one of her 4 participants. She decided to do 4 case studies because she got involved in reading the Multiple Case Study Analysis book by Robert Stake. And he says, 4 or 5 are fine, 5 would be ideal, 3 would be great. But again, it all comes back to, what are your purposes for the research in question, and what do you want to know? So I always ask people 2 questions when I start working with a student on their dissertation. What do you want to know, and how are you going to get there? What techniques are going to get you there? So if you want to stay in a classroom over time for the entire school year, you could study 1 teacher or 1 principal and follow them around and shadow them. And this is a classic sociological design, classic anthropological design in ethnography and microethnography. So it depends. Again, I have to say it depends. Many of my students like to take 5, a nice number because Bob Stakes done so and other writers. But really, it doesn't matter. It matters what you want to know. You could study 1, 2. In sociology, the classic comparison and contrast is 2. You get 2 outstanding principals and then compare and contrast, or whoever. 2 outstanding baseball players, 2 outstanding tennis players. By the way, when I say outstanding, I mean it. You don't want to study someone who's a bad teacher or a bad principal. We already know, we can feel it in our gut who's a bad teacher, you've had some of them yourself. I've had some in the past. But what you want to study are the exemplars and the best of who is practicing what you want to know about. So there is no one method, but I have to say this, and educational research is a baby compared to history, anthropology, sociology, all those fields that have always used ethnographic work and are really befuddled by why we're so taken with using jargon from another paradigm and asking questions with that jargon instead of learning about ethnography or about narrative research or about phenomenology, which is very popular right now as people go introspectively into who are they and what does life mean. Phenomenology is a good theoretical and practical framework for looking at a good qualitative study. So we have similarities with the other paradigm in that we design a study, we collect data, we analyze and interpret it. So that's how we do it. And it's inquiry. All their disciplines love this approach. It's only education who's worried. And why are we worried? Because we're in the public space. We have many accreditors, NCATE, SACS, the state, the feds, the local people, local environment. So we're always under a microscope, and bureaucrats want numbers. They don't want words. Since they want numbers, we've been, for 80 years, obsessed with these numbers. So that's the best I can tell you.
What do you say to people who question the generalizability of qualitative studies?
Which is a question that many editorial board reviewers ask themselves, because many studies begin as a qualitative study, and then they turn into a quantitative discussion of the results.
I know, it's amazing. Thank you for asking this, because yes, people often confuse this. And first of all, straight out, case studies are beautiful, and the value of them is that they are the case, the unique case. You, the researcher, and readers of the results of the research will be the people to make sense of more fully that unique case. So we are not concerned in any way with generalizability. In social sciences, it just doesn't work. It works well in chemistry, organic chemistry, biology, all the hard sciences, but in the social sciences, I think what's more critical and what's more powerful and important is the uniqueness of the case study. So all qualitative work is some kind of a case study. It might be a phenomenological case study, an interview case study, or whatever. And I say that because there are quantitative case studies that do look for generalizability. But in our field of qualitative methods, which has a long and elegant history, by the way, from the last century, and historically, the first stories that we knew about are from the Aborigines of Australia, the oldest living humans ever described. They told their stories in cave paintings. And then we also know the ancient Babylonians and so on, the Egyptians. So we've always had storytelling as part of the human connection. And I think a good way to think about qualitative work is for you to find where you are in this long history of ideas and knowledge that we've amassed since those cave paintings, since those early cave paintings, till now, when you can go on YouTube and listen to anybody's oral history or life history just like that. Because I'm interested in oral history primarily at this point, I just looked on YouTube. Oral history on YouTube. Well, there was over 3 million possibilities. And so I thought, okay, I'll take one from the 1940s and one from the 50s and so on. And there are people who are alive today still talking about how they survived World War II, for example, or Vietnam vets, because they want to tell their story. Or you'll see people who just have been returned from Iraq who had their legs amputated and how they get around, or whatever. You have the Holocaust stories. The survivors of the Holocaust, as you know, Steven Spielberg did a project where all the living survivors have been captured now on video so that their stories and every single event that they went through, it's just so powerful. And to learn from that one case is as powerful as anybody generalizing. So I'm not dismissing it altogether, but I want to say that it just doesn't pertain to qualitative work. And there's no way around that. That is not even an issue. And I'm sorry for editors who are tied to inappropriately using generalizability when they should not. It doesn't make sense. And by the way, there are people who claim any social science research, that is even social science research, that is quantitative, is not generalizable in any way. And so you see, if you start looking at statistical articles now, you'll see they avoid generalizability too, because in the social sciences, this does not pertain. It's great for chemistry, but it doesn't work in education. I hope that makes sense. That's all I can tell you.
So what about the idea of using mixed methods?
Well, that's a touchy subject and very controversial too. As you know, the literature, anybody who's listening to this, please Google critiques of mixed methods, because, and I throw my hat in with those people who critique mixed methods. I find it a quick way to try to avoid discussion of the true meaning of qualitative work and its importance, and also the true meaning of quantitative work and its importance. Both are important, but when you mix them, you get sort of what I call mixed up methods. It's sort of mix, but no, where are we going with this? Because if you truly did have a mixed method study, and by the way, I'm still looking for one. Anybody out there, if you got one, send it to me. I'm dying to see it. If there is such a thing, it would have to be congruent. You would have to have the same theoretical framework to make sense. But if you're using quantitative methods, you already eliminated constructivism, phenomenology, critical theory, critical race theory, critical pedagogy, tribal critical race theory, red pedagogy. All these are eliminated if you're doing a survey. The survey's too easy, and I don't mean that it's easy in, planning it, using either a survey on the web or by mail. Those are hard parts, and you're still going to have to analyze and interpret data somehow. But in our method, in qualitative work, we value the theoretical construction. And here's another issue that I want to leave you with on mixed methods and why basically I disagree with it. I would rather use the classical term complementary methods and make it make sense than mixed methods.
Is your perspective in this idea of qualitative research being postmodern?
Well, it's everything. It's historically present in all of our lives, and I guess postmodernism, because we're in the postmodern era, it's coming to light more. I think it's always been there, but we're definitely postmodern in approaches. For example, the theoretical approaches. Critical pedagogy and all the critical theories are big movements forward in theory, as is phenomenology, which started, as you know, from clinical settings and from therapy and counseling, which is perfectly suited to qualitative kinds of questions. So I think that qualitative methods are definitely postmodern, but they have been used in throughout history. It's just the way that they're used now is in a new light, now that we're aware of issues of race, class, gender, and inequality, for example. And as I mentioned somewhere today, we're about trying to make a better world. That's why we do this research. We want a socially just society. We want to move towards that. We may never achieve it, but we can't give up and not try. And that's, I think, the key component of doing qualitative research.
Very good. And what do you think about the idea of comparing narratives, approaches to post-rationalist approaches?
Well, we could always spend time on that, but why bother? I mean, I think everyone has their own approach to research. Your job as a researcher is to define it, describe it in detail, explain why you're using it, and let it work for you. And I would just run with the approach that's suited to the question at hand and the abilities that you as a researcher have to conduct that research.
I see. Is there something else that I should have asked you and I didn't, or something that you would like to add?
Well, I think if I added anything, I would say that this kind of research requires a great deal of more time than other methods. And time is money, so it would also include you saving money to finish a dissertation. For example, I have students who spend $3,000 or $4,000 to finish a qualitative dissertation, from the costs for transcriptions, digital equipment, travel, copies, and so on. So I would say be aware that you're investing in this not just personally but economically as well.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you so much
Oh,
for spending the
I
time
loved it.
answering some of our questions about qualitative research.
It's a pleasure.
And thank you for leading the field in that
Well,
area.
thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Very good.